At 7:12 on a Saturday morning, I signed for a certified letter from an HOA I did not belong to. I was standing beside the runway mower with wet grass stuck to my boots. The carrier handed me a thick white envelope from Rainier Vista Estates, the subdivision east of Mercer Field. I did not own a house there. I had never attended one of their meetings. Until that morning, I had never received anything from their board more official than a forwarded complaint about an airplane someone could not identify. The first page ordered every airplane, helicopter, and balloon associated with Mercer Field to remain at least 1,000 feet above Rainier Vista. I read that sentence twice. Then I looked past the envelope toward the eastern end of our grass runway. An airplane landing on runway 27 crossed the outer edge of the subdivision while descending through a few hundred feet. It had to. The runway did not move, simply because someone typed a different number into a letter. Holding 1,000 feet over those roofs would not make our approaches quieter. It would make landing physically impossible. The board gave me 14 days to correct the violation. If I failed, it said their attorney had been authorized to pursue all available remedies. Elaine Porter signed the last page as HOA president, acting, according to her signature block, on behalf of all 360 homeowners. My first reaction was disbelief. I remember letting out one short laugh, the kind you make when a number is so detached from the physical world that you assume somebody else will correct it before you have to. Then I reached the attachment marked Legal Expenditure Authorization. Rainier Vista was prepared to spend more on outside counsel in 1 quarter than Mercer Field cleared during a good summer. That changed the problem. Elaine did not need to be right about the sky to hurt us. She only needed to keep sending letters, forcing responses, contacting county offices, and asking questions that our insurer would expect us to answer. Mercer Field was not a major airport. We did not have a legal department or a public relations office. We had 1 turf runway, a maintenance hangar, 6 based airplanes, and me. Every hour I spent answering a claim was an hour I was not inspecting an engine, mowing the approach end, or doing work that kept the field open. I carried the packet into the office and laid every page on the old laminate counter. I photographed the envelope, the certified delivery label, the 14-day deadline, and the budget attachment. Then I scanned the complete packet twice and saved the copies in separate places. I was halfway through naming the files when I noticed a phrase on page 3. The letter described Mercer Field as a new incompatible use. My father had opened the airfield in 1969. Rainier Vista had not existed then. Neither had its clubhouse, its decorative stone entrance, or any of the street names printed at the top of Elaine's letter. I did not yet know who had chosen the word new. I also did not know whether 360 homeowners had truly authorized what Elaine was doing. But I knew the envelope had turned 2 questions into a deadline, and I had 13 days left to answer them. To understand why the word new bothered me, you have to understand what Mercer Field actually was. It was not the kind of airport people pictured when they heard the word airport. There were no terminals, baggage belts, rental car counters, or scheduled flights. We had a 2,600-foot turf runway, 80 feet wide when the summer stayed dry enough for me to keep the edges cut. There was 1 maintenance hangar, 1 smaller row of tie-downs, 6 light airplanes based on the field, and an office with a coffee maker older than some of our pilots. My father opened the field in 1969 on pasture that my grandfather had used for cattle. The first runway was little more than a mowed strip with white tires marking the corners. My father added drainage, a windsock, and the hangar, 1 piece at a time. I grew up picking stones out of the grass before mowing and holding flashlights while he worked on engines after dinner. I left for a while. I earned my airframe and power plant certificates, worked maintenance for a medevac operator, and learned what it meant when a small, overlooked defect became a serious problem at altitude. When my father's knees made climbing onto wings difficult, I came home and gradually took over. By the time Rainier Vista appeared, the field had already been operating for more than 3 decades. The subdivision was built in phases, beginning in 2003. Its sales brochures emphasized the mountain view and the open valley. That open valley existed partly because nothing tall could be placed directly east of our runway without creating a hazard. The approach corridor that helped preserve the view was the same corridor some residents later described as an unexpected intrusion. Our traffic was modest. On a clear July Saturday, we might record 20 or 30 movements, with each takeoff and landing counted separately. During a wet winter week, the log could remain blank for days. Most activity involved local proficiency flights, maintenance checks, or owners taking their airplanes out for the afternoon. A medevac helicopter had staged at the field twice during road closures. Balloon crews used our windsock as a valley reference. None of that turned Mercer Field into an industrial operation. Residents did not react to it in one uniform way. Children along Juniper Loop waved so consistently that one pilot started rocking his wings when it was safe. A retired teacher named Ruth emailed me sunset photographs whenever the light caught an airplane over the ridge. One family walked to the fence every Sunday their grandson visited. Other people had reasonable concerns. They wanted to know why an unfamiliar helicopter circled once before landing, whether run-ups could happen later in the morning, or why a plane used the eastern approach instead of the western one. Wind answered some questions. Courtesy could answer others. Elaine's letters erased all those distinctions. They described aircraft as frequent, unpredictable, and increasing. So I pulled the movement log for the previous 12 months. The total was lower than the HOA packet implied, and there had been no sustained increase. I checked fuel receipts, maintenance invoices, and the sign-in sheet for transient pilots. The pattern was ordinary: summer weekends, occasional training, long weather gaps. At that point, I still believed the dispute came from bad information. I prepared a 1-page summary showing monthly movements, common operating hours, and a phone number residents could use to report a specific event. I thought if Elaine saw the numbers, the 1,000-foot demand would be replaced by a conversation about practical noise measures. What the log could not tell me was what Rainier Vista buyers had been told before they signed their closing papers. Several residents insisted the airport had barely been mentioned. I had no reason yet to think they were lying. I decided to meet the board before digging through 20-year-old records. That was my first mistake. Not because meeting them was wrong, but because I assumed everyone in the room wanted the same question answered. The special meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the Rainier Vista clubhouse. I arrived 10 minutes early, with 30 copies of my operations summary and no lawyer. Elaine had arranged the chairs in rows facing a projector screen. The opening slide showed a large passenger jet descending over rooftops. Mercer Field's runway could not support an aircraft remotely that size, but the picture established the feeling she wanted before anyone discussed facts. She introduced me as the operator responsible for the aviation activity affecting our community. It was technically accurate in the narrowest possible way. It also made every balloon, helicopter, and airplane in the valley sound like one service I had dispatched. I explained that final approach altitude was determined by the need to reach the runway safely. I explained that pilots could use a preferred direction when wind, traffic, and safety permitted, but that I could not promise one route in all conditions. Then I passed around the movement summary. If you report the date, time, direction, and anything you can identify, I said, I can compare it with our log. If it was one of our aircraft, I can speak to the pilot. Maya Chen sat in the second row with hospital scrubs showing beneath her jacket. She asked how often helicopters used the field, whether maintenance run-ups could be kept out of early mornings, and what happened when wind opposed the preferred approach. Those were answerable questions. I told her helicopter visits were irregular and usually related to service or staging. I said I already avoided routine early run-ups when practical, and I explained that landing with a strong tailwind could create more risk than the preferred route prevented. Then a man near the back said I was operating an industrial airport over a residential neighborhood. I should have corrected the description and stopped. Instead, I told him the airport had been there before his street, his house, and probably the realtor who sold it to him. The room tightened. He had exaggerated our operation, but I had answered his exaggeration with dismissal. Maya looked down at my summary. Elaine looked pleased. She advanced to a slide labeled Community Support. It showed a large number 360 above a row of house icons. I asked whether all 360 households had signed a petition. Elaine said the board had received overwhelming concern. When I asked to see the wording and response categories, she said member information was confidential. She would not say whether residents had supported better communication, noise mitigation, litigation, or closure. I offered to compare every dated complaint with our movement log. Elaine declined. "This is about community experience," she said, "not whether your paperwork validates what residents hear in their own homes." That sentence told me the data was not failing to answer her question. It was answering a question she did not want asked. After the meeting, Maya caught up with me near the clubhouse entrance. "I checked the box for a safety review," she said. "I did not support closing the airport." She pointed through the glass at the projected slide, still glowing behind the empty chairs. Her name had appeared in a list of supporting households. "Did you give them permission to use your name that way?" I asked. No, she was not suddenly on my side. She still wanted fewer early flights and clearer answers about helicopters. But she did not like being turned into support for a position she had never taken. I drove home thinking Elaine had inflated a survey because she expected nobody to inspect it. I believed that would become the central problem. 3 days later, a balloon descended over Rainier Vista, and Elaine found an event much easier to sell than a spreadsheet. Rosa Delgado launched west of the valley shortly after sunrise that Saturday. She was a commercial balloon pilot with more than a decade of experience, and she had done what balloon pilots do before launch: reviewed forecasts, released a small test balloon, briefed her passengers, and coordinated with her chase crew. The surface wind was light. A higher layer was expected to carry her northeast toward open farmland. About 40 minutes into the flight, that layer weakened, and a lower current pushed her east toward Rainier Vista. A balloon does not steer like an airplane. A pilot changes altitude to find air moving in a useful direction, but there is no wheel that turns the envelope left around a particular house. Rosa tried 2 levels, watched her ground track, and decided not to stretch the flight while hoping for a better field. Her chase crew called the owner of a 5-acre parcel beside the subdivision. The owner knew balloons occasionally crossed the valley and gave permission to use his open field. Rosa lined up the landing while the crew drove toward the access road. The balloon passed above several backyards while descending. Children came outside. Phones appeared. In one video later shown at the county meeting, you could hear a child laughing while an adult said, "That thing is right over us." Both reactions were real. Rosa touched down near the center of the field. The basket dragged a short distance through dry grass and stopped upright. No fence, roof, vehicle, or landscaping was damaged. Elaine arrived before the chase trailer. She parked her SUV across the field's public road exit and called another board member, who positioned a pickup behind the trailer once it entered. Elaine told Rosa that the HOA prohibited aircraft landings and demanded proof of insurance before anyone removed the balloon. The parcel was not HOA common property. Its owner had granted permission, and the balloon had already landed. But Rosa did not debate those points beside a nylon envelope the size of a house. She photographed the SUV, pickup, trailer, road signs, and field entrance. She saved screenshots of her GPS track and weather update. She wrote down the time and asked the property owner to confirm his permission by text. Then she called the county's non-emergency number and reported that the recovery vehicles could not leave. I heard part of the exchange over a handheld radio and drove over. By the time I arrived, the balloon was mostly deflated and lying in a long, bright curve across the field. Elaine stood near the exit with her arms folded. Rosa's crew was rolling fabric toward the basket. "This is exactly what we warned you about," Elaine told me. "I did not launch this balloon," I said. "Your airport attracts aviation activity." That was the first time I understood the word associated in her demand. It was broad enough to make me responsible for anything airborne that supported her argument. The property owner asked Elaine to move the SUV. A neighbor who had been filming told her the road was public and that children were watching. She finally moved one vehicle far enough for the trailer to turn, although the pickup remained until a deputy called her. There was no dramatic arrest. An officer arrived later, took statements, photographed the location, and assigned an incident number. That ordinary record mattered more than a spectacle would have. By noon, Rosa had sent me a clean folder containing her forecast, updated weather, GPS track, landing permission, photographs, and the incident number. She had documented the event without claiming it proved more than it did. Elaine sent a different version to Rainier Vista. Her email said the board had successfully prevented an unauthorized aviation operation from continuing. It did not mention the owner's permission, the weather change, or that recovery was already underway. It made confrontation sound effective. I expected the blocked exit to weaken her position. Instead, at the next board meeting, Elaine used the balloon as evidence of an immediate safety threat and obtained authority for a larger legal retainer. The incident gave me better records. It gave her a better story. The following Monday, Rainier Vista's attorney notified me that the HOA was preparing a county petition for airport compatibility relief. A second letter demanded preservation of maintenance records, incident reports, pilot communications, and flight information going back 20 years. 20 years of records at a small field did not live in one searchable database. Some were digital, some were in logbooks, banker boxes, old email accounts, and my father's filing cabinets. Even identifying what the demand covered would cost time and legal advice. That was when I called Priya Nanduri. Priya practiced aviation and land use law. I paid for a limited strategy session because I could not afford to hand her the dispute and say, "Take care of it." I brought Elaine's packet, the movement summary, Rosa's folder, and the new preservation letter. Priya read the 1,000-foot demand first. "An HOA cannot simply establish a flight altitude," she said, "and it cannot require an approach that makes safe landing impossible." That was the answer I expected. I started to relax, but that does not mean they cannot hurt the airport, she continued. She drew 3 columns on a legal pad. The first was flight operations. The second was land use and compatibility. The third was cost. Federal authority mattered greatly in the first column. It did not erase county hearings, noise complaints, insured inquiries, political pressure, or legal invoices in the other 2. A weak demand could still generate a real process. A small operation could win every central legal argument and close, because defending those arguments cost more than the business could carry. Priya did not bury me in case names. She mentioned established tracks, ranges, farms, venues, and airports, that had accepted limits, reduced activity, or disappeared after development grew around them. They were here first, could be relevant history. It was not a business plan. I had used that phrase at the clubhouse because it felt decisive. Priya made me see that it answered only one part of the conflict. Rainier Vista residents still lived under the approach. Legitimate impacts did not vanish because my father mowed the first runway before their foundations were poured. Then Priya asked the question that changed our strategy. Under what conditions did the county approve those houses beside an active approach corridor? I did not know. My father's files included letters to the original developer. In one, he objected to a row of proposed homes close to the eastern boundary. Another referred to an airport disclosure exhibit, but the exhibit was missing. I found a faded planning map with handwritten notes and no recording number. Priya told me not to assume what the final document said. Drafts, promises, and recorded conditions were different things. I submitted a public records request to Cedar Ridge County for the subdivision application, staff reports, hearing minutes, recorded conditions, maps, and correspondence involving Mercer Field. 2 days later, a records clerk called. The planning file predated their complete digital archive. Several boxes were stored off-site. Retrieval would take up to 10 business days. Elaine's deadline expired sooner than that. Priya sent a narrow response, preserving our objections to the HOA's demand, without making claims we could not yet support. I began cataloging records, so the preservation request could not later be used to suggest that ordinary disorganization was concealment. That cataloging took 3 evenings. I set folding tables inside the hangar office and separated operational logs from maintenance records, correspondence, and insurance material. My father had labeled boxes with descriptions useful only to him: East End, Old County, things to keep. Inside one box, a 1998 fuel receipt sat beside a photograph of me washing an airplane at 16. In another, I found inspection notes for an aircraft that had not been based at Mercer Field in 12 years. The work was tedious, but it changed how I approached the dispute. Elaine's advantage came partly from compressing everything into one alarming category: aircraft activity. My defense depended on separating things accurately. A maintenance run-up was not a landing. A transient helicopter was not one of our 6 based airplanes. A balloon using a privately owned field was not an airport operation. If I wanted the county to respect those distinctions, my own records had to be organized enough to prove them. Meanwhile, ordinary business continued. One owner needed a compression check before a planned trip. A drainage rut opened near the south edge after 2 days of rain. I postponed repainting runway markers because I spent that budget on Priya's initial review. None of those consequences looked dramatic, but they were how a legal campaign began weakening a small field before any official had ruled on anything. For the first time, I stopped thinking of the dispute as an argument about altitude. The sky was only where the conflict was visible. The useful evidence might be buried in a county box nobody had opened for years. The archive appointment took place in the 5th week after Elaine's first letter. Cedar Ridge County stored older planning records in a low concrete building behind its public works yard. The reading room had 2 metal tables, a scanner, and shelves of boxes labeled with project numbers instead of street names. Owen Blake, the county's aviation land use planner, met me there. He was not assigned to rescue Mercer Field. His role was to help identify which documents were official, which were drafts, and how the county's current review related to the older approval. The Rainier Vista file filled 3 boxes. The first contained environmental notes and traffic studies. The second held maps, hearing notices, and correspondence. Near the bottom was a large folded exhibit showing Mercer Field's runway and a tapered approach zone extending across the land where the subdivision would be built. The third box contained the documents Priya had told me not to invent in my head. The county had allowed Rainier Vista to proceed after the developer accepted recorded conditions addressing the existing airport. Purchasers were to receive an aircraft noise disclosure. The plat included an navigation easement, acknowledging ordinary aircraft passage through the approach area. A non-obstruction covenant limited structures and vegetation that could penetrate the mapped zone. The language did not say residents waived every complaint. It did not give me permission to create unnecessary noise. It did not make Mercer Field immune from all future regulation. But it made one fact impossible to ignore. Aviation use was neither new nor unanticipated when the county approved the homes. There was also a less dramatic condition that interested me almost as much. For the first 3 years, the developer had agreed to fund a neighborhood airport liaison. Meeting notes showed residents could report specific events and receive operational explanations. The arrangement ended during the transition from developer control to the homeowner association. Nobody in the current dispute had mentioned it. I scanned the relevant pages and wrote down every recording number. Owen showed me where the final plat and easement could be confirmed in the recorder's index. He would not tell me what conclusion the county should reach. Verify the final versions, he said. Do not rely on what happened to be in the planning box. Priya checked the scans against the recorded documents. Only after she confirmed the numbers did we use them in our supplemental response. The records changed our position, but they did not solve the case. Rainier Vista could still present verified noise or safety concerns. The county could still consider compatible mitigation. The documents simply removed the story that an unknown airport had suddenly appeared beside unsuspecting homes. Owen compared our filing with the HOA petition and noticed something else. Elaine's submission described Mercer Field as an expanding incompatible use, but did not disclose the recorded conditions or the old liaison program. The county requested supplemental information from both sides before scheduling its review. I sent Maya the public recording numbers, not because she had become my representative inside Rainier Vista, but because the HOA had used her name as evidence of support. She replied later that evening. The documents looked familiar. Months earlier, during a question about a backyard tree, the management company had emailed the airport-related plat restrictions to the board. Maya had seen the attachment referenced in a message thread, but it had not appeared in the packet members received for the airport meeting. That discovery moved the conflict inside Rainier Vista. I could challenge Elaine from outside. Only residents could determine whether she had authority to spend their money and speak in their names. Maya requested the association's records as a member. She asked for the original survey language, response totals by category, meeting minutes, board votes, the attorney engagement letter, invoices, and communications with the management company about Mercer Field. Elaine did not refuse outright. The board produced documents in stages, with gaps described as processing delays. That mattered because it kept the story realistic. Nobody opened one folder and found a signed confession. Maya and Peter Lang, the HOA treasurer, had to compare dates, versions, and amounts. The first clear problem was the survey. Residents had been offered several choices. They could request more information, support evaluation of noise measures, express general safety concern, or support legal action aimed at ending airport operations. The presentation shown at the clubhouse had merged the first 3 categories into supporting households. Only 7 households selected the strongest closure option. Maya's response had been counted because she requested a safety review. Ruth, the retired teacher who sent me aircraft photographs, had been counted because she wanted notice of unusual helicopter activity. Neither supported closing the field. The second problem involved money. Peter had voted for a capped legal consultation so the board could understand its options. The engagement letter reflected that cap. After the balloon landing, Elaine invoked an emergency spending provision and expanded the retainer without returning to the members. The invoices now included preparation of the county petition, preservation demands, and strategy calls Peter had not understood he was authorizing. The third problem was the missing disclosure packet. Emails showed the management company had forwarded the recorded plat conditions to Elaine months before the special meeting. Elaine had replied that the documents required more context. They never appeared in the member packet or her county petition. None of those facts proved she had begun with a plan to deceive everyone. Her first concern about low aircraft might have been sincere. The problem was what happened when evidence complicated the promise she had made. Each time the facts narrowed her mandate, she broadened her language. Maya organized a small records committee. She deliberately included one resident who disliked airport noise and another who had not taken a position. They verified documents rather than planning an anti-Elaine campaign. When Maya called me, she made the boundary clear. People here will not defend your airport just because it is old, she said, but they may defend their right not to be listed as supporting a lawsuit they never approved. That was fair. I had wanted the neighborhood to recognize the obvious physical reality of the runway. Maya showed me a different source of pressure. Most residents did not need to love airplanes. They needed to understand what their dues were funding and whether concern had been converted into consent. Peter asked the management company to pause new non-routine invoices until the board discussed the cap. Elaine responded by scheduling an emergency meeting 48 hours before the county's supplemental deadline. Her notice said the purpose was to protect property values and prevent the next aviation incident. By then, the argument was no longer 7 households against an airport. It was whether a board president could turn ambiguity into a mandate, then use the mandate to finance the next round of pressure. Elaine opened the emergency meeting with a photograph of Rosa's balloon above the rooftops. The image had been taken with a phone zoom that compressed the distance. The balloon looked close enough to touch a chimney. Elaine called it evidence that the community could not wait for another incident. She spoke about property values and cited other towns where residents had won quieter operations. What she did not distinguish was whether those results came from voluntary procedures, negotiated limits, airport closure, or facts completely different from ours. Maya had asked me to attend and answer operational questions. Priya advised me not to turn the meeting into a legal presentation. The county already had our recorded documents. Inside the clubhouse, the immediate question belonged to the members. What had they authorized? A resident near the front compared Rainier Vista to people moving beside a racetrack and later demanding silence. Another resident pushed back. Being there first cannot excuse every impact forever, she said. Months earlier, I would have treated that as an attack. This time I said she was right. Mercer Field's age did not excuse careless operation. It did not prevent us from changing a maintenance schedule, answering specific complaints, or using a preferred approach when conditions allowed. The recorded easement protected ordinary aircraft passage. It did not require every neighbor to enjoy it. I offered 4 measures. First, no routine early morning maintenance run-ups. Second, a preferred approach direction when wind, traffic, and safety permitted. Third, a direct complaint channel with tracking numbers and responses tied to actual movement records. Fourth, a quarterly liaison summary showing traffic patterns, verified complaints, and actions taken. Those measures would cost time, and they would create commitments residents could measure. They would not close the airport. Elaine rejected them for that reason. The objective is to eliminate low overflight of our homes, she said. All low overflight? Maya asked. All avoidable overflight. Who decides what is avoidable? Elaine did not answer directly. She returned to the 1,000-foot demand, even though no one had shown how an aircraft could maintain that altitude and land on our runway. Maya then projected the original survey categories. She read each question and displayed the response count. More information, noise evaluation, general safety concern, legal action to end operations. 7 households had selected the last category. The room did not erupt. People leaned toward the screen. Some checked old emails on their phones. The quiet was more damaging than shouting because residents were recalculating what they had been told. Questions came from people who had not attended the first meeting. One woman asked why her request for a contact number had been categorized as support for legal action. A man who disliked weekend noise asked whether the board had ever voted specifically on closing the airport. Peter checked the minutes and said the recorded motion authorized council to evaluate options. It did not contain the word closure. Elaine argued that boards were elected to make decisions without polling members on every invoice. Several residents agreed with that general principle. The disagreement was not whether a board could hire a lawyer. It was whether a limited consultation had quietly become a campaign whose public claims exceeded the vote behind it. Maya kept returning to exact language. She did not say nobody supported Elaine. 7 households clearly did, and others might have joined them after the balloon event. She said the board could present that support honestly, seek a new vote with clear choices, and accept the result. What it could not do was treat every request for information as consent to eliminate the neighboring use. Peter stood and summarized the capped consultation, the emergency expansion, and the current invoices. He did not accuse Elaine of stealing. He asked for a member vote before the association spent another $1 pursuing operational restrictions against neighboring property. Elaine said a vote could jeopardize the county deadline. Peter replied that the deadline had been created by a petition members had never seen in final form. Maya asked Elaine to stop stating that all 360 homeowners supported the campaign. Elaine adjourned the meeting without allowing a vote. The next afternoon, she submitted the HOA's supplemental letter to the county. It still described Rainier Vista as a united community of 360 homes seeking relief. Maya's written objection and Peter's spending records were already in the county file. Repeating the number after it had been challenged changed its meaning. It was no longer an optimistic summary from an early survey. It was a factual representation the county could test. The compatibility review took place in a county hearing room with beige walls, fluorescent lights, and a microphone that cut out twice. There was no jury, no judge in a robe, and no moment when a federal agency entered with a dramatic order. The county could review land use compatibility, documented impacts, and compliance with recorded subdivision conditions. It could not invent flight rules, direct pilots into unsafe approaches, or pretend the approval history did not exist. Elaine went first for Rainier Vista. She presented complaint totals, selected videos, the balloon incident, and letters from residents describing fear and disrupted sleep. Some complaints were specific. Others used phrases like constant traffic without dates or aircraft descriptions. Those residents were not lying about being bothered. The problem was that the record did not separate what they felt from what action they had authorized. Elaine asked the county to require a 1,000-foot buffer, prohibit balloon activity connected to Mercer Field, and impose operating limits while a longer study was conducted. When my turn came, Priya had me present the evidence in the order we had collected it. I began with the movement logs. They showed seasonal variation, but no recent surge. I acknowledged that a modest number on paper could still bother someone beneath a flight path. The purpose of the log was not to invalidate experience. It was to provide a measurable baseline. Next came Rose's folder. Her forecast, GPS track, owner permission, photographs, and incident record showed that the balloon landing resulted from changing wind and ended safely on permitted property. The documents did not prove every balloon flight harmless. They showed that this event had been mischaracterized as an operation I directed, and the board stopped. Then Priya introduced the recorded subdivision conditions, the avigation easement, aircraft noise disclosure, and non-obstruction covenant. She also provided the approval minutes and the developer's temporary liaison commitment. She kept the argument narrow. "These records do not erase every concern," she said. "They do contradict the petition's central premise that ordinary aviation activity in this corridor is new and unanticipated." Finally, I described the 4 voluntary measures I had offered. I agreed to record them in the liaison plan if the county restored a structured process. That mattered because I was not asking the room to choose between closing the field and ignoring the residents. Owen asked Elaine whether all 360 households had authorized litigation aimed at ending or materially restricting airport operations. Elaine said the board had authority to protect community welfare. He repeated the question. Maya submitted her original survey response, the response categories, and her written objection to being listed as a closure supporter. Peter submitted the meeting minutes, capped engagement letter, emergency expansion, and current spending total. The county council asked whether the recorded airport disclosures had been reviewed before the HOA filed its petition. Elaine said the documents had seemed outdated and incomplete. Owen pointed out that the recording numbers remained active and that the HOA had not identified any release or amendment. That was the point where the campaign lost its momentum, not because one document destroyed every claim, but because each unsupported shortcut depended on the others. The airport had to be new for the disclosure history to seem irrelevant. The balloon had to be deliberate for emergency spending to seem necessary. General concern had to equal closure support for 360 homes to appear united. Once those claims were separated, the county had a different dispute in front of it. The written decision arrived 6 days later. The county declined the relief Rainier Vista requested. Any future compatibility petition would need verified operational data, accurate statements of member authorization, proper notice, and analysis of the recorded conditions. The decision recommended restoring a neighborhood airport liaison and collecting 6 months of structured complaint data before considering additional mitigation. It did not fine Elaine. It did not award me damages. It did not prohibit residents from complaining again. The most immediate consequence occurred inside Rainier Vista. Peter froze payment of non-routine legal invoices pending a member vote. Once residents saw the amount already spent, the survey categories, and a county-supported path that did not require open-ended litigation, enough of them signed a petition for a special election meeting. I walked out of the county building with Mercer Field still open. I also walked out publicly committed to measures I now had to honor. That distinction mattered. Documentation had defended the runway. It had not relieved me of being a neighbor. Rainier Vista held its special election 2 months later, after the notice and candidate periods required by its governing documents. Elaine lost the presidency. She did not lose her house, her livelihood, or her right to question airport activity. She remained a resident beneath the approach path, and some neighbors still agreed with her more than they agreed with me. Maya joined a limited governance committee focused on records access and spending authorization. She did not join the airport board or become an aviation enthusiast. Peter stayed long enough to close the expanded legal account and publish a plain-language summary of what had been approved, what had been spent, and which invoices remained disputed. The association adopted a policy requiring a member vote before legal spending above a defined threshold could be used to change the operation of neighboring property. It was not an anti-Elaine rule. It applied to the next board as well. Mercer Field and Rainier Vista restored the liaison process. I kept the commitments I had made. Routine maintenance run-ups moved out of early mornings. We published a preferred approach with a clear statement that wind and safety controlled the final decision. Complaints received tracking numbers. Each quarter, I summarized movements, verified events, and any response taken. The first report exposed a few surprises. One late-night noise complaint occurred when Mercer Field had recorded no activity at all. Another involved a helicopter crossing the valley without landing. Two complaints correctly identified one of our pilots repeatedly using an avoidable early departure time. I spoke with him, and the pattern stopped. The number of complaints fell, partly because people received answers and partly because every sound no longer became evidence of one giant campaign. Some residents still closed their windows when an airplane approached. Others still brought children to the fence. Rosa flew through the valley again the following spring. The wind carried her north, and she landed miles from Rainier Vista. When her balloon appeared above the ridge, several children waved. I saw one resident step onto a deck, watch for a moment, and go back inside. That was a more honest ending than everybody becoming friends. The recorded easement protected Mercer Field's legal position, but the most important discovery was not hidden legal language. It was the gap between institutional volume and community consent. A letterhead made 7 closure responses sound like 360 homes. A budget made an impossible demand feel powerful. Records forced each claim back to its actual size. I also had to admit something about my own position. The airport was here first was history, not a complete answer. If I wanted the field to remain part of the valley, I had to distinguish between demands that made safe operation impossible and adjustments that cost us little while helping people live beside us. On summer mornings, I still mow the eastern end of the runway. The roofs of Rainier Vista rise beyond the grass, exactly where they were during the dispute. Airplanes still descend over the outer edge when wind favors runway 27. The neighborhood did not disappear, and neither did we. The boundary is clearer now. The process is also harder to weaponize. So where do you think that boundary should be? Should an airport that existed first be allowed to operate exactly as it always has? Or should it still change reasonable parts of its routine for the neighborhood that came later? If you lived in Rainier Vista, would you try to close the field, negotiate specific noise measures, or first investigate whether the HOA truly had authority to speak in your name? And if you were in my position, would you make the voluntary concessions I made, or would you worry that every concession would encourage the board to demand more? I want to know who you think was right, and what a fair solution should require each side to change. Leave your answer in the comments.